Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Unseen Wisdom. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss any of our future deep dives. Today, we're diving into a story that's been making waves in South Africa, the exodus of major companies.
Yeah, it's a trend that's really alarming, and it points to some pretty deep-rooted issues within South Africa's economy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I understand just how serious this is. We're going to be focusing on the recent closure of ArcelorMittal. Now, for those who might not know, this was South Africa's only primary steelmaker, and it's shut down. Well, it's not just about a company closing its doors. It's about 3,500 people suddenly without jobs. It's about families and communities being impacted. And the potential ripple effects are just huge.
Yeah, the human cost is really what hits home here. South Africa is already struggling with a 33.5% unemployment rate, the highest on the entire continent. So this exodus of industry is really just adding fuel to the fire.
It paints a pretty bleak picture, for sure. Our source highlights a whole string of big names that have recently pulled out of South Africa. HSBC, BNP Paribas, Shell, even Rolex.
Yeah.
And what's striking is that these companies represent such a diverse range of sectors. It's a clear sign that something is fundamentally wrong.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder what's going on. What's making South Africa such a difficult place to do business, that even these giants are packing up and leaving?
All right, let's unpack this. Our source uses ArcelorMittal as a case study, and it's a story of a company that fought hard to stay afloat, but ultimately couldn't overcome the challenges.
Yeah, and what's fascinating is they didn't just give up. For a whole year, they pleaded with the government for support, for measures that could have prevented closure. But those pleas, as our source puts it, fell on deaf ears.
So what were these roadblocks that even a company as large as ArcelorMittal couldn't get past?
Well, our source identifies three major factors. And it's important to see how they're all interconnected. We're talking about Transnet struggles, Eskom's unreliability, and the impact of government policy itself. Let's start with Transnet, South Africa's state-owned freight rail and logistics company.
Okay, so this is where things get really interesting. Transnet's rail network has become so unreliable that ArcelorMittal was forced to rely on road transport to move its goods, which is way more expensive.
Right, think about the sheer volume of steel they were producing. Transporting that by truck instead of rail significantly impacted their operating costs and squeezed their already tight margins. It's a prime example of how infrastructural failures can cripple entire industries, especially one like steel production where logistics are everything.
Once you've got Eskom, the power utility that's almost synonymous with blackouts at this point. It feels like South Africa has been stuck in a perpetual state of load shedding for years now.
And the impact on businesses has been nothing short of devastating. Eskom's unreliable power supply and constant load curtailment forced ArcelorMittal to find alternative energy sources, again pushing their costs higher. It's hard to imagine the frustration of trying to run a major industrial operation when you can't even guarantee you'll have electricity.
It's like trying to run a marathon with a sprained ankle.
Yeah.
You might finish, but it's going to be incredibly painful and far more difficult than it needs to be. But there's another layer to this story, is there? Government policy also played a role in ArcelorMittal's downfall.
Absolutely. And this is where things get a little controversial. The government put in place a preferential pricing policy for scrap metal, which essentially gave scrap-based steelmakers a huge advantage over companies like ArcelorMittal that produce steel from iron ore.
So instead of supporting its only primary steelmaker, the government's policies inadvertently favor the competition. It's a tough situation, especially when you factor in the flood of cheap steel imports, particularly from China.
That's a crucial point. The global steel market is incredibly competitive, and Chinese imports, often subsidized by their government, have flooded the market worldwide, putting immense pressure on local producers like ArcelorMittal. It's like they were caught in a double bind, squeezed by domestic policies favoring competitors, and a global market awash with cheap imports.
No wonder they couldn't survive. It makes you wonder if the South African government truly understood the consequences of its actions. What was their perspective on all of this?
To understand that, we need to hear from the CEO of ArcelorMittal, Cobus Verster.
This is where the human side of this story really hits home.
Verster acknowledged that while Eskom's improved power generation in recent months offered some relief, the lack of protection for the local steel industry sealed the company's fate.
It sounds like he felt utterly let down by the government's inaction.
Absolutely. And he didn't mince words. He said, the government is willing to listen but not able to take decisions. It's a damning statement that suggests a disconnect between their words and their actions.
Okay, so we've got Transnet, Eskom, and questionable government policies. creating a perfect storm of challenges for businesses in South Africa. But our source also mentions a broader, almost philosophical issue at play here, something called the Great Doubling. What exactly is that?
This is where we zoom out and consider the global forces shaping South Africa's economic landscape. The Great Doubling refers to the surge in surplus labor in countries like China and India.
Okay, I'm following. So there's this massive pool of available workers in those countries. How does that impact South Africa?
We'll combine that surplus labor with globalization and low tariffs, and it becomes cheaper to produce goods in places like China and then import them to South Africa.
So instead of creating jobs in South Africa, the jobs are being created elsewhere.
Exactly. And this is leading to a displacement of labor in countries like South Africa, further fueling the unemployment crisis. It's a complex web of factors. But the Great Doubling highlights how global shifts can have very real local consequences.
Wow, that's a lot to process. We've got infrastructural woes, policy missteps, and global economic forces, all converging to create a very challenging environment for South African businesses and workers.
And what's particularly worrying is that ArcelorMittal's closure might just be the beginning. If these underlying problems aren't addressed, we could see more companies choosing to exit, leading to even more job losses and economic decline. This raises some serious questions about South Africa's economic future. You know what's striking about the ArcelorMittal case? It really exposes a deeper trend, like this deindustrialization in South Africa.
You mean a shift away from manufacturing and heavy industry?
Precisely. And that raises serious concerns about the long-term health of the South African economy. If you lose your manufacturing base, you lose a critical source of employment, innovation, and ultimately economic resilience.
So it's not just about the immediate 3,500 jobs lost at ArcelorMittal. It's about the potential domino effect on an entire sector. What are the implications of that? What does that even look like?
Well, one major concern is a widening trade deficit. If South Africa starts importing more manufactured goods than it's exporting, that could put downward pressure on the currency, leading to economic instability.
And then there's the social impact. 3,500 jobs represent real people, families, communities, livelihoods. What happens to them when those jobs vanish?
It's a recipe for social unrest, unfortunately, rising unemployment, especially in areas that were once dependent on industries like steel production, can lead to increased poverty, crime, and a sense of hopelessness. It can create a downward spiral that's incredibly hard to break free from.
It's a stark reminder that economic decisions have very real human consequences. But is this exodus of industry inevitable? Is there anything that can be done to turn the tide?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? There are no easy answers. But our source does point to some potential solutions. Addressing the infrastructural challenges is a crucial first step.
So fixing Transnet and ensuring a reliable energy supply.
Exactly. Investing in infrastructure is absolutely essential for attracting and retaining businesses. A modern, efficient transportation network and a stable power grid. These are non-negotiables in today's global economy. If South Africa can't provide those basic necessities, companies will simply go elsewhere.
And what about the government's role in all of this? What can they do to create a more business-friendly environment?
There's a lot of debate about the extent to which governments should intervene in the economy. Some advocate for a more hands-off approach, while others believe that the government has a responsibility to support key industries, especially when faced with global competition.
It sounds like a delicate balancing act. Too much intervention could stifle innovation, but too little leaves industries vulnerable to external forces. How do you find that sweet spot?
That's the challenge, and the ArcelorMittal case really highlights the complexity of this issue. Some argue that the government's preferential pricing policy for scrap metal actually ended up harming ArcelorMittal's competitiveness.
It's a tough lesson to learn. So how do you strike that balance? How do you protect domestic industries while still fostering a competitive market?
Well, one approach is to implement what are called targeted industrial policies. These policies support strategic sectors, while also encouraging innovation and efficiency.
So instead of broad protectionist measures, you focus on specific areas where South Africa has a competitive advantage or the potential to develop one.
Precisely. This could involve things like tax incentives, research and development grants, and skills development programs. It's about giving businesses the tools they need to succeed in a global market.
Okay, so we've got infrastructure upgrades and targeted industrial policies on the table. Are there any other ideas being considered?
Some economists argue that South Africa needs to diversify its economy, moving away from its reliance on commodities like minerals and metals.
So instead of putting all your eggs in one basket, you develop a wider range of industries, things like manufacturing, technology, services.
That's the idea. This would make the South African economy more resilient to changes in global commodity prices and would create a broader spectrum of job opportunities.
It sounds like a sensible long-term strategy. But diversification takes time, right? And it requires investment. What about the immediate crisis? What can be done to help those who have already lost their jobs because of this industrial exodus?
That's where social safety nets and retraining programs become critical, providing unemployment benefits, job search assistance, and skills development opportunities can help people affected by job losses transition to new careers.
It's about giving people a lifeline, a chance to get back on their feet and contribute to the economy in a new way.
Exactly. This requires a coordinated effort between the government, businesses, and civil society. It's a societal challenge that demands a collective response.
This great doubling concept is a real game changer, though. It suggests that even if South Africa gets its act together domestically, it's still going to face intense competition from countries with large pools of low-cost labor. How do you even begin to compete with that?
That's where innovation and what's called value-added production come in. South Africa needs to focus on producing goods and services that are high quality, specialized, or cater to niche markets where they can command a premium price.
So instead of trying to compete on cost alone, you differentiate yourself by offering something unique, something superior.
Precisely. And this requires investing in research and development, skills development, and cultivating a culture of innovation. It's about moving up the value chain and finding a niche where South Africa can truly excel.
Okay, so we've got a roadmap for addressing the challenges. Infrastructure upgrades, targeted industrial policies, economic diversification, social safety nets, and a laser focus on innovation. It's a long list, but it's not impossible.
And what's encouraging is that there are already pockets of innovation and entrepreneurship emerging in South Africa. There's a growing tech sector, a vibrant creative industry, and a spirit of resilience amongst South Africans that's truly inspiring.
It's a reminder that even in the midst of these challenges, there's hope, there's potential. It's not all doom and gloom.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that economic transitions are rarely smooth sailing. There will be bumps along the way. But with the right policies, investments, and mindset, South Africa can navigate this difficult period and come out stronger on the other side. The key is to learn from the ArcelorMittal case and other instances of industrial decline, and use those lessons to chart a more sustainable path forward.
It's a powerful reminder that the choices we make today will shape the future of the South African economy and the well-being of its people.
And that brings us back to our central question. What are the potential long-term consequences of this industrial exodus for South Africa?
And just as importantly, what steps can be taken to address the underlying challenges? It's a complex issue with no easy answers, but it's a conversation we absolutely need to have. What are your thoughts on this? What stands out to you?
It's a wake-up call, a reminder that we're all interconnected in this globalized economy.
So what does this all mean for our listeners today? Whether you're someone facing job losses, or worried about the future of South Africa, or just trying to understand these forces at play in our world, this industrial exodus has implications for all of us.
Yeah. I think what happens in one corner of the world can create ripples that are felt everywhere. You know, the ArcelorMittal closure isn't just a South African issue. It's part of a global phenomenon. Countries around the world are facing similar challenges as automation, globalization, and new technologies reshape the economic landscape.
So South Africa's experience could actually offer valuable lessons for other nations, the ones facing similar pressures.
Absolutely. By examining the factors that led to ArcelorMittal's closure and this larger trend of industrial decline, we can identify pitfalls to avoid and strategies to create more resilient and inclusive economies.
It's about learning from each other, sharing both our mistakes and our successes. Hopefully we can work together to build a more sustainable and equitable future for everyone.
Yeah, and this brings us to a final thought-provoking question for you to consider. In a world where industries are constantly shifting and money flows so easily across borders, what can countries like South Africa do to attract and keep investments, create good jobs, and build a prosperous future for their citizens?
It's a tough question with no easy answers, but it's one that demands our attention, our creativity, and our collective effort. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Share your insights in the comments below. As always, thank you for joining us on The Unseen Wisdom. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more deep dives into the unseen forces shaping our world.